Today I want to take a look at some of the most famous politicians and leaders in Star Wars lore and put them on the political compass. This is a simple two-axis chart. On one axis, we rate an individual on the authoritarian and libertarian scale, as in if they believe in a government where authority should be obeyed or if they believe that personal freedom should be maximized. The second axis of this scale is left versus right from an economic standpoint. The left is defined by those who want more centrally controlled economy with shared distribution of resources, whereas the right believes that the economy should be driven by competition and free market practices. Now, before people say all lefties are commies and all right-wingers are fascists or some other weird and crude generalization, the point of this exercise is to further examine the beliefs and views of different Star Wars characters and how their own experiences in life shape their views and push them in the direction that they would go. Who knows, some of our viewers might be surprised that some of their favorite characters might hold political ideologies that are completely different from their own. I also want to highlight that, political ideas, economic ideas themselves are not inherently evil or good. Some are stupid or impractical, of course, but they are all just ideas. What people do with these ideas, what their intentions are as individuals, and how competent they are at carrying out such policies is what's important. I hope this video can teach people to remember that even if an individual has different political views from you, there's more benefit in discussing and talking about issues and potentially learning about their point of view rather than just attacking and opposing someone because of the group they belong to or the view they support. You'll find that sometimes all we really need to give each other is a bit more empathy and understanding. Our political choices are not given to us at birth, but more of a reflection of our upbringing and the many challenges we've faced in life. This is an issue that I personally am very passionate about. If you guys watch this channel, you know I talk about this a lot. And one of the tools that I actually use to inform myself better on what's going on in the wider world is ground news. Ground news aggregates stories on the biggest news topics of the day and allows you to see how the media industry as a whole is covering this issue worldwide. For instance, if I search the topic Donald J. Trump, I can see that Ground News has collected over 20,000 stories about him, which is further broken down into location of the coverage and where the media bias leans, followed by which publications talk about him the most. We can then select individual stories about Trump, like him pleading not guilty to the criminal charge levied against him for illegally holding onto classified documents at his personal residence at Mar-a-Lago. This is a pretty straightforward story, just reporting on his plea, and it's mostly covered by centrist publications. But if you take a look at the blind spot section, which I really like, it shows you stories on the topic of Donald Trump that's only getting covered by one side. For right-leaning publications, it's Ohio Senator J.D. Vance announcing that he will attempt to block future Justice Department nominees in protest of Trump's indictment. And for the left-leaning publications, it's all about Attorney General Garland defending the special counsel in charge of the Trump case. It's features like the blind spot that made me personally reach out to Ground News for a sponsorship, something I've never actually done before on this channel. I think their mission is incredibly important to create more transparency in the news industry and also help people challenge their own deeply held political views. I think that is the only way we can personally grow into more mature consumers of news. And right now, Ground News is giving you guys 30% off of their Vantage level subscription until the end of June. Please check out the description down below if you want more information or to sign up for Ground News. Thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. We start our analysis off with one of the most important and cunning politicians in galactic history, Chief Palpatine, otherwise known as Darth Sidious. Now, as a Sith, he's all about, breaking free of his chains and doing whatever he wants. And so his personal political philosophy is very libertarian, but we all know how it goes. What we want in our personal lives is very different from what we want with the wider society. You've probably heard of the term, I'm a socialist when I'm with my family and my friends, but when I interact with wider society, I'm usually a capitalist entrepreneur. And that's kind of how Emperor Palpatine ruled. The closest people around him, individuals like, Wilhelm Tarkin, were basically allowed to do whatever they wanted. They were essentially an extension of Palpatine and his power. They were completely above the law. But in order for Palpatine to be free, everyone else has to lose their freedom. Such are the thoughts of a narcissistic Sith Lord who becomes an emperor. Now, Palpatine didn't start off this way, of course. His first forays into the Senate during the Republic era were low-key and muted. He quickly developed alliances behind the scenes and used the powerful political lobby known as Damas Holdings to get money into the right hands and pay off the right people. And so up until the point he becomes chancellor, a lot of the people who actually voted for him had no idea what his policies were. They just liked him as an individual. Palpatine made sure to be very careful and not offend anyone by taking too strong of a stance on anything. And the few stances that he did take were very safe and already adored by most people anyway. Individuals like Palpatine are extremely dangerous because they lack true values and are opportunists, and more than willing to use populist methods to gain the love and support of the populace. Palpatine's ultimate goal was just power, and so he was willing to play the game any way necessary in order to get that power. And Palpatine took this a step further than most politicians. He created false flag attacks and conflicts that gave him more acceptable ways to get the populace to adopt what were really just authoritarian measures. The Emergency Powers Act, proposed by Gungan Senator Jar Jar Binks, is your typical authoritarian legislation designed to break down the checks and balances that guard a republic. In this case, that meant transferring some of the powers that the Senate held to the executive branch and also getting rid of term limits so that Palpatine could rule until the Clone Wars was over. The Emergency Powers Act gave Palpatine the right also to pass the Military Creation Act, which allows for the creation of the Clone Army. While this seems like the right response to the surprise appearance of the Separatist droid army, this act further shifts more power from the Senate to the executive position. Then, in the last year of the Clone Wars, Palpatine would orchestrate a crisis on the world of Scipio, home to the intergalactic banking clans. At the time, the Republic depended on the IGBC to regulate currency and also print it. Once this crisis emerged, confidence in IGBC fell, which was a real problem because they basically controlled the galactic currency and made it stable. Now, Palpatine would nationalize the banking system because he's a benevolent leader and he really cares about the galactic economy and how it affects the average individual. This move would also allow him to create a Federal Reserve for the Galactic Republic. So I think it's pretty obvious that Palpatine is an authoritarian. Throughout his political career, he continuously seeks to gain more and more control over the government and the various institutions that run the galaxy. He also tries to control the populace. He keeps doing this until he alone decides everything about what happens in the galaxy. Now, creating a Federal Reserve also gives us an insight into what Palpatine's economic strategy would be. Having a Federal Reserve is a relatively good idea because it allows you to control interest rates and print money. This allows the Fed to control inflation, but also make more money for future government projects in case they're running low of cash. With the rise of the New Order, we find out that Palpatine was very eager to nationalize several different companies and natural resources. This was in order to lower the cost of his military expansion as much as possible. In some ways, the Empire is also a military-first dictatorship, where the military institution plays a huge role in society and has access to a great deal of political power. This naturally also means that Emperor Palpatine prefers a more centrally controlled economic system. Yet we don't really see Palpatine providing services or redistributing wealth equally to the population. And also private companies are allowed to function within a somewhat limited free market as long as they are politically loyal to Palpatine. In this way, Palpatine doesn't fit into the traditional view of left versus right-wing economics. In many ways, his empire is the worst of both worlds. He has all of the inefficiencies you usually see with a centrally planned economy, and at the same time, you have these greedy oligarchs who are able to loot the government coffers at the expense of the average taxpayer just because they have a connection to Emperor Palpatine. It's not quite the kleptocracy we see in Russia, and it's not quite the crony capitalism we see a lot here in the States, but it's something in between. Actually, it reminds me quite a lot of the economy of Nazi Germany. And so it's not surprising that Emperor Palpatine would also fit in the same place that Adolf Hitler would on the political compass. Absolutely max out on authoritarianism and somewhere in the middle when it comes to economic policy. Next up, we have Boba Fett, an individual who takes on the role of ruling over a small settlement on Tatooine known as Mos Espa. Now, Boba Fett comes from the criminal underworld, so he has a natural fear and mistrust for authority. And we're not just talking about soldiers, police, or the Jedi either. We're also talking about the absolute authority wielded by people he's worked for in the past, like Darth Vader or someone like Jabba the Hutt. One gets a sense that Boba Fett's adventure into the Sarlacc pit convinced him to never work for anyone else again. And now, as a daimyo, it seems like Boba Fett is bent on righting a lot of the past wrongs he experienced as a bounty hunter. When Black Chrysanthemum fails to kill Boba Fett, the Hutts that hired him are more than willing to just throw the Wookiee away.
Tatooine dupadudarame. Adwara Wookiee patalopagkapa.
Chache Opa.
Boba Fett has grown wise in his old age, and he realizes that it's much easier to befriend people than make enemies that you have to worry about.
Release him.
No hard feelings. It's just business.
And later on, the Black Chrysanthemum would return to help Boba Fett defend his territory. It's a good investment, and this is basically how Boba Fett treats all of his employees, whether it's the Scooter Gang or his right-hand woman, Fennec Shand. Boba Fett believed in the individual, and I think that's rooted in the fact that he's a clone. Not just any clone. He was actually very different from all of the other clones. He was an identical copy to Jango Fett. And I'm sure it really messed with his head that so many people had the same face as him. And so I think finding an individual identity was really important for Boba Fett growing up. Now, due to the way the criminal underground works, the Daimyo of Mos Espa isn't technically the leader of the town, the mayor is. But the Daimyo is responsible for protecting businesses and running some side hustles here and there. These are really the only services that the Daimyo provides, and the only thing he gets in return is like protection money. Plus, we're on the world of Tatooine, which is mostly populated by self-resilient moisture farmers and traders. The idea of an authoritarian regime appearing on Tatooine doesn't seem likely because I don't think the locals would take kindly to that kind of system at all. So Boba Fett definitely will be more on the libertarian side of the political scale. And when it comes to economic decisions, Boba Fett seems to distribute resources as fairly as possible with his underlings. But he also mostly resorts to a more laissez-faire attitude when it comes to accepting protection money and so on. As long as payments come in, it doesn't really matter where it comes from, let the market decide. Although it should be mentioned, we do see Boba Fett counter price gouging when a water seller tries to rip off a bunch of Scooter Kings.
What do they owe you?
1,300 credits.
For water?
1,300 credits.
Give them 500.
What? They owe 1,300.
If you don't like it, you can move to Mos Eisley.
It's not really a policy per se, but Boba Fett clearly understands the dangers of a completely unregulated market. I would say that he has a more balanced view when it comes to economics. And so while Boba Fett tends to veer towards more libertarian style of rule, on an economic scale, Boba Fett is close to the middle and balanced in his approach. He clearly supports the free market, but isn't afraid to step in when things get out of hand. Chancellor Mon Mothma is an institutionalist at her core. She believes so strongly in the Republic Senate that she stayed on for the Imperial Senate transition. And when all of the anti-Palpatine senators fled or were killed or imprisoned, she somehow just managed to stay there. She would continue to respectively voice her opinion about Palpatine's wrongdoings.
I'm a polite, sometimes indecisive senator who spends her days fighting and failing to protect separatist do-gooders, battle Empire overreach, and irritation, as you so harshly put it.
Now, we can take Mon Mothma at her word, or we can accept her for what she really is. Mon Mothma appears exactly as how her detractors wanted her to appear, as a non-threatening woman who's slightly clumsy. She has a fine taste for the arts and the rights of alien minority groups. She's probably someone they would call a champagne socialist behind her back, who at first sight of any hardship will quickly abandon her causes. But obviously this was all a front. Mon Mothma was a very shrewd political operator who knew exactly how to manipulate people and use the system to her advantage. If people tended to underestimate her, then so be it. Whatever kept her safe and able to pursue her goals. As the leader of the rebellion, Mon Mothma was a great delegator. She would pass on a lot of her duties to underlings that she trusted, and she would focus on what the rebellion would stand for and what its main principles were. With the war coming to an end swiftly after the Battle of Endor, Mon Mothma pushed for reconciliation and a negotiated end to the war with the Empire. Mon Mothma would try to encourage Imperials to surrender by offering pardons for the majority of Imperial personnel. She would also set up the New Republic Amnesty Program, a robust government project designed to deprogram Imperial soldiers and make them positive and contributing members to the New Republic society. It's not surprising, seeing how Mon Mothma had a stellar record of voting against Palpatine's request for more funding for the military during the Clone Wars. Large programs like the New Republic Amnesty Program are, however, a sign of a strong central government. Institutionalists like Mon Mothma believe that government is the solution to most problems. She's definitely not a libertarian, but she likes large government, but that doesn't necessarily make her an authoritarian either. After all, she risked her life on several occasions to fight against one. And when she assumes power, she seems to be very aware of her own power and tries to limit it. She actually resigns from the chancellorship due to health concerns. And many of her critics would later blame the fall of the New Republic on her. They would state that she didn't make the executive branch strong enough, so, partisan bickering took over the Senate, and there was just, political gridlock as a result. Therefore, I think Mon Mothma is north of the authoritarian-libertarian split, but really not by much. Her voting against military spending and her attempt to basically disarm the New Republic military before the war had even stopped means she's very anti-war, and also probably against military spending by the government. However, Mon Mothma would spend large amounts of money on the New Republic amnesty program and spend even more in order to rebuild the galaxy after the Galactic Civil War. In the end, Mon Mothma was forced to abandon her idealistic views on the war. She became a pragmatist, and therefore she ends up pretty center on our political compass. Lastly, we have the opposite of Mon Mothma. We, of course, are talking about Saw Gerrera, the violent revolutionary. Saw Gerrera was not a very complex man. He was a warrior at his core, and he had learned how to fight against occupiers pretty early on in his life thanks to the foreign internal defense mission carried out by the Jedi during the Battle of Onderon. Saw clearly is an anarchist. He follows no rules, is apologetically anti-imperial, and more than willing to commit what others might consider war crimes in order to kill Imperials. I mean, he might have started out a little bit more different, more idealistic, more inclined to saving refugees instead of getting them caught in deadly crossfires. But the sheer amount of killing and death that Saw experienced created a madness and hatred inside of him for any kind of authority that wasn't his.
Krieger's a separatist. Maipei's a neo-republican. The Gorman Front, the Partisan Alliance, sectorist, human cultist, galaxy partitionist. They're lost!
Interestingly enough, Saw Gerrera was still beholden to the mighty credit. Without money, he couldn't fund any of his military operations. But he wasn't for sale to the highest bidder. Even when Luthen Rael offers him a lucrative Imperial target to attack and some pieces of equipment, Saw Gerrera still refuses because he's not in the mood. Now, it's easy to imagine that Saw Gerrera is more left-leaning when it comes to economic ideology. After all, he is somewhat modeled after the violent revolutionary known as Che Guevara, who was also known for murdering and torturing his political prisoners. But given the fact that the partisans depended heavily on looting equipment from the Empire or buying it on the black market, I imagine Saw Gerrera would not trust a planned economic system where one has to pay taxes and share wealth. I think Saw Gerrera values the equipment that he steals from the Empire a lot because oftentimes they're taking casualties while stealing this stuff. Perhaps it's not fair to give Saw Gerrera an economic ideology rating because he clearly doesn't have much of one. His fight is not about economics, but about dealing damage to the Empire pure and simple. Plus, he clearly does not trust individuals outside of his group. He is completely isolated in his mind. And so this is where Saw Gerrera stands on the political compass. So there you have it, guys. 4 different leaders with 4 very different ratings on the political compass. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.